Hello, my friends, fellow whistleblowers and advocates and allies. You know, the really exciting part of my job, being Jane Turner, FBI whistleblower, the really exciting part of my job as a podcaster is the fact that I get to meet some of the most remarkable people on the planet. And you know, today we have Matthew Hoh. And you may have heard of him. He is a media darling. You may not have heard about him, but you're going to learn about him today because he is a warrior and a hero. He currently is a fellow at the Eisenhower Media Center, also a senior fellow with the Center for Informational Policy. And Matthew, I'd really like to start out where you were born, where you came from, and how you became such an inspirational figure. Could you tell us your hometown?
Sure. I was born in New Jersey, right outside New York City in Bergen County, in 1973.
Very good. And my understanding is that you said you lost your faith in college, and yet you graduated with a comparative religion major. Can you tell me
Right.
a little bit about that? Because I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I think a lot of us have these things in our lives, right? These juxtapositions or these paradoxes. And so I went into college and I wanted to be an archaeologist. And the comparative religion program allowed me to study a lot about ancient history. And I think like a lot of other students, you take these courses and then you realize, oh, I've got a major already in comparative religion. So I took a lot of classics, I took a lot of political philosophy, I took a lot of literature, but I also took a lot of religion courses, and of course a secular study. Right. So this wasn't Sunday school. This was, how do we know the book of Isaiah was written by four different authors over a period of hundreds of years? Right. So a lot of deconstruction work. And I absolutely love that. I absolutely love that type of literary detective work. And I think it was very helpful to me in the long term because it taught me to think. And I had great high school teachers as well, but I had some really terrific professors in college who really taught me to think critically. But so I did. I lost my faith in college as a process of going through that type of study. But I'm not convinced that it was the coursework and it was like, again, the deconstruction and kind of the comparing religions around the world. And that led me to lose my faith that I had been brought up with. I think that probably would have occurred regardless, because what it was that made me lose my faith, and I still keep a great deal of it. I wear a cross around my neck, even though I don't believe in the resurrection, was the experiences of my life. It was seeing our society, interacting with people. It was the experiential and not not the study that caused me to lose my faith. But certainly, I think, if anything, the coursework gave me a capacity to absorb that loss of faith, and has allowed me to be more open in terms of my understanding of people, our society, our world, so forth.
Well, when I think of you, Matthew, I think of the saying by George Santayana, who said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." That seems to be a perfect motto for you, because as people listen to this, they'll understand. You joined the Marines and had two deployments to Iraq, correct?
Correct.
And you were suffered some injuries. Do you want to tell us about those?
Sure. I graduated from college and I went to work in finance, and I was bored. It's just long story short, and I ended up in the Marine Corps. Went to officer candidate school in January of 1998, and I was looking for something with a bigger purpose. And I wanted to prove myself, and I wanted to do something that was serious, and I wanted to do something that was bigger than me, right? And it the Marine Corps is where I ended up with that, and I ended up in the Iraq War twice, and then later in the Afghan War. And yeah, I do. I carry with me the invisible wounds of war as they become known, and these are wounds that either have always existed throughout warfare, such as post-traumatic stress disorder or moral injury, but also wounds that are had existed, but in terms of the numbers, in terms of the quantity, had not before. And this is specifically, I'm talking about traumatic brain injury.
Yes.
And we survived explosions and contact with the enemy in the sense of firefights, and took gunfire, mortar rounds, RPG rounds, whatever, roadside bombs that in previous wars would have killed us.
Yes.
So we would be hit by a roadside bomb and literally walk it off. The vehicle would be destroyed, but because of the armor of the vehicle, because of the body armor we had, we literally walked away from things. And I think a lot of us who were in combat have these stories. And you could see that in a number of different ways. And that hid the violence of the wars, I think, in a lot of ways. I think people look at it and say, well, there's only 7,000 soldiers killed in both the Iraq and Afghan wars. It's not 58,000 in Vietnam, 50,000 in Korea, 400,000 in World War II. But when you, I think, examine it and look at the ratios of casualties, and now you look at the hundreds of thousands of veterans who have traumatic brain injury, you understand that there was a very real wounding that occurred, because you would be in a vehicle, that vehicle would be blown up. You would again walk away, dust yourself off type of thing, but your brain had been impacted in a number of ways, whether it was by blast waves, or whether it was just being shook around inside your skull. And very similar, not the same, but similar to what the football players and boxers and rugby players and so forth go through with their own forms of traumatic brain injury. There's a latency in terms of its development, in terms of its manifestation. And so in my case, the last time I probably was, because I don't think I had any type of exposure to explosions in Afghanistan that would have provided this type of injury, but certainly in Iraq and also in training as well. So that was the last time in 2007. For me, the manifestation of that traumatic brain injury doesn't really show itself until around 2013, 2014. And so what you see with a lot of veterans with these wounds is that you see them okay for a period of years.
Yes. And
then, right, and the numbers are absolutely, off the charts, and something that I don't think many people understand. And the VA, to its credit, was doing a pretty good job of putting out this information. And now they seem to be much more tight-fisted and closed-lipped.
Yes.
About it. They're still putting out information, but they're not giving you the details. So they're not giving you the context of the veteran suicides, not giving you real good information on the numbers of TBIs and who specifically had them. They lump them all together, so you don't get an idea of how many brain injuries occur in the military, how many veterans have brain injuries because of just life, because accidents happen, because it's a fairly dangerous job with the training and the type of work they do, and you're always going to have a certain amount. But what's the delta? What's the difference? How many more brain injuries do we have because of the wars? We see the VA really failing on that in terms of pulling out that info to show us what the costs of the war actually were.
Right.
And so when we look at the, say, number of Iraq and Afghan vets with traumatic brain injury, the estimates are as high as 20%. And
that's
so,
amazing.
right. And so when you understand that how many millions, a couple million Iraq and Afghan vets, you'd apply that 20% number, right, Jay? Now you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people with this, right? And then, of course, hundreds of thousands with PTSD, because the PTSD rate is about the same as it has been for all wars. There's a misnomer out there that PTSD is something new, or previous generations didn't really have it. No, they all had it, but they didn't keep track of it, and no one talked about it, right?
And it had a different name. It had a different name.
Yeah. Absolutely. They called it different things. PTSD doesn't become a diagnosis by the American Psychiatric Association until 1980.
That's
so,
correct.
right. I mean, no one was even being diagnosed officially with it as we know it now and understand it now until 40 years ago. So how can you say,
in 2016, Matthew, you were diagnosed officially with traumatic brain injury, TBI, and you also have PTSD. And you share with whistleblowers, because I'm going to get to your whistleblowing story here because it is incredible. but you share PTSD with whistleblowers. You also have a moral injury. During that time, you had severe depression, and you are 100% disabled, according to the government. So
Right.
you have been through the ringer. You are a true warrior, and I believe you were, correct me if I'm wrong, but the political officer in the Foreign Service, and you had a post as a senior civilian representative for the U.S. government in the Zabul, did I pronounce that correctly?
Correct. Yeah.
Oh, province. So that's the Euphrates and Tigris River valleys in Iraq.
Oh,
And you were there between 2004 and 2006. Is that
right.
correct?
In Iraq. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, in Iraq. And then you, of course, had a second deployment and went to Afghanistan. So you truly are a warrior. And then you decided to become even more than a warrior. You decided to become a hero. And here you had this job, which was extremely important, extremely important. And the United States was in Afghanistan for 8 years up until that point.
Correct.
So you had this, I mean, really pivotal position. And tell us, I think you were 8 months there in Afghanistan, correct?
No, five when I resigned.
Okay, 5. So
Yeah.
tell us what caused you to write a letter to Ambassador Powell and submit your resignation from these highly, highly sensitive positions and blow the whistle on what was going on.
So I get to Afghanistan in 2009. I was done with the Marine Corps in 2008. Resigned my commission and then went into the State Department. I had worked with the State Department quite a bit in the past, and so I was appointed as a political officer, which is a pretty rare thing.
Yes.
And I went to Afghanistan. That was my purpose. I was morally and intellectually broken at that point, for with thoughts in my head, but a desire to see that this war was fundamentally different than the Iraq War, and it wasn't. I mean, we could be here all day, Jade, talking about, well, the terrain is this way, and the culture is this, and the modern history, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it was fundamentally the same war, and understanding that, and then seeing the escalation of the war by the Obama administration, seeing that the Obama administration in its war making was no different than the Bush administration for its purposes, for its reasons, and for its chance of success. And seeing the futility of that, the error, the bloody error that was ongoing and was only going to be worsened by an escalation of the war. We have to remember how great of an escalation of the war was. When President Obama comes into office, there's about 30,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. There's about 15,000 NATO troops in Afghanistan. There's about equivalent number of contractors, about 30,000 contractors there as well. Within a year and a half, there's 100,000 American troops, about 40,000 NATO troops, and about 100,000 contractors. So we're talking about a 250,000 man army was put into the Afghan war. And in the escalation of that war played out exactly as myself and many others understood it would, including many of the people I was working with, many people I was serving with. And so seeing that, again, my own personal issues with being intellectually and morally broken, but then too, just seeing where this was going, I couldn't go along with it any longer. I laid out my case for why escalation was a bad idea, and I wrote it up in a letter and resigned officially with the head of the Foreign Service, Ambassador Powell. But that letter ended up going, of course, to the ambassador in Afghanistan, Carl Eikenberry. Then it went to the senior representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, who was Richard Holbrooke. And then, of course, that went on further then to Secretary Clinton, to Vice President Biden, to President Obama. My understanding is they all read the letter. It was I had no intention, and I don't think of myself as a whistleblower, but I had no intention of doing anything other than quitting at the time. I wanted to write that letter and said, I'm done with it, leave me alone. And I wanted to just try and become normal after that point and do something where I wasn't harming others. And coming home and seeing the discussion about the Afghan war, particularly in that fall of 2009, people remember there's a lot of debate about that escalation of the war. And President Obama had already sent several tranches of soldiers, and now they're talking about sending another tranche of soldiers to reinforce and escalate the war. And just a discussion about it. All I wanted was the opportunity to write an op-ed, basically condense my resignation letter down to 700 words and have the Washington Post or New York Times or someone like that write it, because I was angry at the conversation I saw taking place. Because what really infuriated me was nobody disagreed with me, with the exception of generals, of General Petraeus and General McChrystal and some other true believers in counterinsurgency whose egos were it was more about their own egos than it was about the logic or the possibilities of what the war would do, what would become. Anyone else, they agreed with me. And in fact, what happens is the Washington Post writes this big article on me, front page, above the fold, 3,500 words or something like that. And I asked Karen DeYoung, who was one of their senior reporters, so why did you give me this much room? Why did you do this? And she said, because everyone I spoke to at the White House, the State Department, the CIA, the Pentagon, none of them disagreed with you.
Right.
And that was my experience, was that what I was saying, as I was leaving Afghanistan, I became a celebrity within the military and diplomatic circles before I even left.
Yes.
Because people were saying, this guy is saying what we all believe. And I'd run into people, I'd see my counterparts, I'd hear from my counterparts, the other political officers in Afghanistan, completely on board with you. And you get the caveat. I wish I could do what you're doing, but I've got a kid going to college in a couple of years. So the golden handcuffs really come into effect.
Boy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and then, so there was a lot of this introduction into a world I didn't know and wasn't anticipating, didn't expect, didn't want. The last time I had been in a newspaper was for high school track back in 1991. Right.
Yes.
I mean, so this wasn't my thing. And, to all of a sudden be on the front page of the Washington Post. And then the next morning, I've got the television trucks in front of my house. It was just like a movie. Right. And now here we are all these years later, still talking about it, because I think, and I appreciate you bringing up kind of my foundation, and particularly say that the study of religion, how what I've been pursuing, I think, like so many others, in this environment that you are such a central role in, is not just the recognition of truth, but some type of justice, some type of accountability.
Justice. Yes.
And I think that's what a lot of us want. A lot of us want that recognition that look, this was wrong. It was done for the wrong reasons. It never had a chance of succeeding. And how come no one's ever been held accountable? We just came out of the holiday season. How many thousands of American families celebrated the holidays without loved ones, let alone the impact these wars have had on the people of Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Libya. I mean, the number is and there's also too, I think, a fundamental problem we have. I don't think most Americans, I can tell you, probably, I would guess, out of the 535 members of Congress, only a handful would know this, but the United States, as far as we can tell, has been engaged in combat operations in 17 different countries since 2001. 17. Again, the vast majority of not just Americans, but members of Congress would have no idea about that number.
Yes.
And so there's something fundamentally wrong, too, about the whole thing that we are caught up in here.
And that's why I brought up Santayana and his quote, because those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Those wars reminded me so much of Vietnam. I lived through Vietnam. I protested Vietnam. And it was just like it was happening all over again. Right. And I have to tell you, you are a whistleblower, Matthew. Whistleblowers speak truth to power. That's the definition. And let's not be humble here. You received the Ridenhouse Prize that was given to for you telling the truth. So as a whistleblower, you told truth to power. And you also got in 2021, because this is not in the past, Defender of Liberty by the Committee for the Republic. So people recognize you, that you blew the whistle, and it was no small thing. Your letter, and I really hope people will attach the Washington Post interview and your letter because it is searing. It is not a letter, it's a missive, and you are searing in your critique. I mean, and you nail it. And I want to make sure people realize that we were in that country until I think we pulled out. It was the last troops in 21.
Yep, August. I think the
August.
last plane out was August 30th, 2021.
That is correct. August 30th of 2021. And I believe that marked was it the 20th anniversary?
It was so U.S. forces first go into Afghanistan. The bombing first starts in October of 2001, so nearly almost 24
20
years. But
20 years.
You have to include, if you talk to any Afghans about it, they of course will say, well, that's just, you Americans deciding that history starts on 9/11, when the Afghans, the war in Afghanistan goes back into the 70s. It is a legacy of the Cold War. The whole conflict is really, the aspects of both the Americans and the Soviets and their roles in it. And people often think that starts with, say, the Soviet invasion in December of 79. It really doesn't. By the time the Soviets invade in December of 79, it's 100,000 people already killed in the fighting. And so there's all these things that we leave out when we discuss because it's too much context.
Yes.
It burdens the narrative. It's not as simple if you have to talk about the fact that, some of the leaders of the Afghan Taliban, particularly one in particular, a guy named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, were actually funded by the CIA as early as 1974 in an attempt, right, to try and these as this devil's chessboard,
yes,
as has often been called, right? And the Soviets were doing the same type of thing as well. Yes. And the consequences to the people of Afghanistan have just been just horrific. I mean, absolutely 40 plus years of warfare that has destroyed a nation and continues to destroy it. 6 million Afghans are on the brink of starvation.
Yes.
It's absolutely sickening what has occurred to these people. But you're bringing up Vietnam is quite apt. One, I think we often disregard that we are part of a continuous line of history, that we are the products of it, and that in many ways we are shaped by it. And our choices, our free will, if you will, is limited to a great degree because of what has already come. But I think, Jane, every generation says it's not going to be this way with us, that we're separate, that what had occurred in the past is not going to occur to us. But what I say to people, particularly about, say, the Vietnam War, is, well, I'll give you an example. Whenever someone says, hey, Matt, what should I read to understand the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan? I say David Halberstam's The Best and the Brightest, and yes, Neil Shahan's A Bright Shining Lie. Both books about the Vietnam War, right? I think Halberstam wrote that book in 72. Yes. Shahan's book was 88, I think. You know what I mean? So, but if you read those two books, you will understand the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I've never had anyone come back and say, hey, I read those books. I don't know, everyone's like, hey, thanks for that recommendation. I understand what you're talking about here, where what we're dealing with is a complex. And something that stretches back. It precedes the founding of this country. I mean, in the sense of the quest for power, the quest for money, the quest for colonization, the imperialism that comes out of all of that. I think the understanding that how does this line work? Well, I mean, the number of years in between the subjugation of the last Native American tribe by the U.S. Army and the coup in Hawaii is 3 years. Right. I mean, so you see, as our manifest destiny, we cross this continent, conquer it. That's not enough.
Right.
We have to now go overseas. And it begins with Hawaii, then, of course, then quickly with the Puerto Rico and Cuba, the Philippines, other places. But yeah, I mean, so I think having an understanding, and I think for me, I understood that. I read this stuff in high school. I was, yes, I was, but the thought for me was that somehow we are different. This generation is different. And we had this in the Marine Corps. When I get in the Marine Corps in 98, there are plenty of colonels and generals and sergeants major who have been in the Vietnam War.
Right.
Right. It was only 25 years
Matthew, this
before.
is what I don't
Yeah.
understand. Like my daughter always complains about the old white men that run this country. Well, those old white men were around during Vietnam.
Right.
And why didn't they learn from Vietnam the lessons that Vietnam provided? I mean, they were glaring. What happened to these guys that they have absolutely no ability to extract from the past?
I think it gets down to, and this is where I think, the work that you do and the people you have on this podcast and the community that you represent, it shows that there always is a very small element that is willing to go against the groupthink, that's willing to go against the group, that's willing to jeopardize, sacrifice, has the courage to stand up against something that, stand against this wave, knowing they're going to get plowed over because their principles are greater than whatever they can get from continuing with the group. And, but this idea that history is not that long ago. I was, the Marine Corps sent me as a captain to the Pentagon. And I was standing there one day, this would have been about 2003 or so, with a friend of mine. She was an officer in the Navy. And Don Ritz, I don't know what we were at, but Don Rumsfeld comes up to us, Secretary of Defense.
Oh.
And we were standing in front of a portrait of Eisenhower. And Rumsfeld goes to us, he goes, you know how old I am? I used to work with that guy. That's how old I am, right?
Oh,
I mean,
my.
he didn't say I knew him. I used to work with him. And then that always stayed with me because Eisenhower, when he graduated from West Point, he would have known Civil War generals, right? So the history, and my friend in a more benevolent example, my friend Bob, who just turned 89, he talks about sitting on his great grandmother's lap, who was born in 1850, and then being, in touch with his great grandchildren now, right? And that connection from 1850 to 2023, and how it only spans 3 lifetimes. But that's a massive amount of time, almost 200 years. And so the past is never that far removed from us. And the lessons are there. And the evidence and the understanding of what's going to happen, how does this proceed, what is most likely going to, what's most likely going to occur, that is oftentimes ignored.
Is it because of hubris, Matthew? How can they ignore such stark lessons? I mean, here, the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. is as big as you can get with all those names. How can they possibly forget? Is it hubris?
It's hubris and greed. It's hubris and greed.
There's a money.
There's money
factor.
involved, but also too institutional greed, career greed, right? The idea that, so there's the hubris, whether it be in its worst form, say within the think tanks that exist all throughout Washington, D.C. that promote these wars one after another, believe that the only thing you need is more war to solve all your problems. One of the chief architects of that, a man who was heavily involved in the Iraq War, a guy named Fred Kagan, just came out with a book basically saying all of this, basically saying the problem with our history has been we haven't been militant enough. And remember, we are a nation that has waged war for almost every year of its existence. The Congressional Research Service has put out a report earlier last year at this point, almost a year ago now, where it found that since 1991, the United States had conducted more than 250 military operations abroad. Right. So in the last 30 years, more than 250 military operations across the world by the U.S. So this is who we are. This is how we do things. And so I think there may be some naivete about that, some foolishness about it, some ignorance about it, lack of experience. But there are certainly those who are believers of it. And there's a greed that comes with it because we have a system that is built upon it, that benefits from it. I mean, we have a system in general that is a violence-based system. I mean, I don't think it's any coincidence that we have 800 some odd military bases around the world. The rest of the world has I think about 30 combined. And we also have the world's most prisoners in the world. We have the biggest prison population in the world, although I think China is coming close to overtaking us. So, I mean, we have a predilection for violence-based solutions here. And you see that, say, in our budget priorities. And you look at over the last 2 decades, this century, and you'll see where the federal government spends its money, its discretionary money, not talking about Social Security or Medicaid or Medicare, but it's discretionary money. The vast majority of that money goes to either policing or to the military. Right. It's so it goes to either overseas wars, to the weapons makers, to the border, to the war on drugs. I mean, in the most recent budget, the 1.7 trillion that the Congress just appropriated back in December, right before Christmas, the estimates are that almost 2/3 of that goes to either the military or law enforcement. I mean, so that your budget tells you who you are. Right. I mean, where you spend your money tells you. I mean, so it is. I think there's a lot of things that undergird it. That's a foundation for it. But I think you can boil those down to hubris and greed, and certainly the power that then shapes that, and then the certainly the tools that come along with that in terms of tamping down anyone speaking out. You yourself and people who listen to this podcast are well aware of that.
Yes. Excellent points, Matthew. I just really enjoy discussing these things with you, but we've got to get around to your whistleblowing because it's really important. So from 2001 to 2021, we were in a war mode, and you wrote your letter on September 10th, 2009. So we were almost halfway through.
Yeah.
That's when your letter was written, and you could have saved, if they'd have listened to you, you could have saved us a lot of death and money, our treasures, our nation's treasures, our nation's most important assets, their military. But they didn't listen, did they? And I want to talk about this letter because it is incredible. You point out, and this is the whistleblowing. I know a lot of whistleblowers said, well, I didn't consider myself a whistleblower. I just wanted the truth to come out. I just wanted them to do the right thing. But you wrote in your letter, and you pointed out the glaring corruption and unabashed graft that was going on, which we all know, looking back, absolutely true. You wrote about a president whose confidants and chief advisors compromise drug lords and war crimes villains who mock our own rule of law and counter narcotics efforts. Bingo. Right on the target with that one. A system of provincial and district leaders constituted of local power brokers, opportunists, and strongman allied to the United States solely for and limited by the value of our U.S. aid and CERP contracts, and whose own political and economic interests stand nothing to gain from any positive or genuine attempts at reconciliation. Bingo. Right on target. And the recent election process, you pointed out, dominated by fraud and discredited by low voter turnout, which has created an enormous victory for our enemy, who now claims a popular boycott and will call into question worldwide our government's military, economic, and diplomatic support for an invalid and illegitimate Afghan government. Bingo! You hit it again. I mean, this letter, like you said, all these military people came up to you, Matthew. They said you nailed it. And of course, your letter isn't just that. I mean, you have 4 pages, and I would recommend people to find the Washington Post. We'll post on our site, but to read this article on you and read this letter. You were so far ahead of the curve. If only they'd have listened to your whistleblowing, but they didn't.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jane. I appreciate that. And I wasn't the only one saying these sorts of things, and it was understood. And the intelligence backed us all up. And if the media who were doing their work, occasionally were printing these things. I mean, I remember one time having to someone questioned me about the relationship of the Afghan government to the narcotics. It's very clear. And for years we have been saying, we still do say that the Afghan Taliban run the drug trade. Completely untrue. Absolute opposite of what it was. The Afghan government controlled the drug trade. Afghan Taliban now has it, but only because they defeated the Afghan government. But just And it was well known. It was well understood. It was open. It was out there. And but the deliberate decision to ignore that. And what do you expect? I mean, you put all these things together. You understand that the insurgency, as it is not about international terrorism. It's primarily localized insurgencies that have been fighting for more than 4 decades, who just want to be left alone, basically, by outsiders, whether they're foreigners or whether they're from their own country. This is a continuation of a civil war that has its roots in the Cold War. I mean, all these things, you compound them, you stir them. What do you think is going to happen? And I mean, it's, again, all the different examples. For me, it was, I was looking at what I had seen and learned in Iraq in 04, 05, and then again in 06, 07. What do you think is going to happen? And then everything I had read and everything I had studied in my life, and, I was a professional military officer, and, this is what my career was. Everything I knew, and we all knew, but it was too difficult for senior leaders to go against the narrative. It was an understood, established narrative. There were domestic political reasons behind the narrative, and there are a lot of big egos involved. And I mean, so you had that. That's what you're up against.
And do you think there was a bloodlust after 9/11?
There was a desire, and that ties into domestic politics. The desire for, President Bush, of course, in the White House to avenge 9/11 and then to be a wartime president. A lot of evidence about that. And it helps Bush in 2004 because the war in Iraq is only a year old or a year and a half old at that point. I mean, there's all kinds of things that occur when you look at the politics of all this. But then by 2006, the disaster of the Iraq war is very apparent. And the Republicans get decimated in the 2006 midterm elections because of it. It is the number one issue for midterm voters in 2006. And in 2008, Barack Obama becomes president. He is an anti-war candidate. He beats Hillary Clinton because of that. He beats John McCain because of that. And so then Bush, Obama then adroitly turns that on its head and says, I was opposed to the bad war, wrong war in Iraq. I'm going to win us the good war. And so he references back to 9/11 and getting revenge. And of course, Afghanistan having almost nothing to do with 9/11. I mean, our understanding of the September 11 attacks, who Al-Qaeda was, how big they were, the fact that all of the hijackers spent more time in the United States than in Afghanistan and Pakistan combined, should tell, right? I mean, the most important safe havens for the 9/11 attackers were the American flight academies and martial arts studios they attended. Those are the most important safe havens. I mean, but the narrative had already been established. And, you saw both political parties, White Houses, whether it be Democrat or Republican, utilize that to justify the war, just primarily, as I see it, so they can make the argument that they were better wartime commanders in chief than the other parties were. And, a lot of death, a lot of destruction, a lot of ruined lives. I mean, you're talking about millions and millions of people whose lives have been ruined because these were tens of millions. And, you boil it down to that, and it comes back again to hubris and greed. And those with the hubris who get these positions either in the military or the White House or in the think tanks who advocate for these wars, who push for these wars, the egos are attached to them. They're underwritten by the people making the money off of these wars, which is absolutely immense.
So, Matthew, excellent points. And you've been backed up by studies since and research. But let me ask you, why do we get it so wrong about other people's cultures that we have this idea that we can just go in and they'll just fling themselves at us and our democracy? And we get this wrong time after time. And it's not only theology, but that plays a large part. But we just figure if we jump into these cultures, they'll just love us.
I think there's institutional aspects to this about institutions' power and an institution's growth. I'm reminded of John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, and he talks about the banks. The banks, they say at one point, they asked the man from the bank, why do you have to do this? And the banks need to keep growing. The bank doesn't keep growing, it dies. And I think all institutions are like that. I mean, I think you could look at this as a number of different things. Say our friends who've done whistleblowing on TSA or the FBI or whatever.
Right.
Why did the FBI or TSA need to encroach on civil liberties the way they did? Well, because they need more. Why do they need more? FBI is already the largest organization outside of the Department of Defense. Why does it need more? It does. It just does.
Yes.
I mean, there's no good. So I think there's a lot of that's involved. That then the desire for and then also too the size of it, the arrogance that comes along with it, right? So whether you're the Pentagon, whether or not you're the CIA, the TSA, whoever you are, there's an arrogance that comes with your authority. That precludes that means that you don't have to listen to other voices, that other things, that things don't apply to you, and that includes principles and values. And again, you get back to this thing where so often when we talk to whistleblowers, wherever they come from Coca-Cola, whatever organization they're coming from, people agree with them. They're not saying things that aren't, that are fantastical or not understood. People agree, people understand it within the organization, but they choose not to act because it's too difficult, too dangerous, not as beneficial, right? There's not I think one of the things that allowed in, say, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan allowed for the civilian side of the governments, the CIA, the State Department, to continue, USAID, for those people to continue with the wars, was because they could only spend a year on them and then they could move on. So you could be a State Department officer who has to work on the Afghan war for a year, and then you're back to your assignment in Hong Kong or or Angola or, Peru or wherever you are, And so I think there was outs for people and I saw this, I know this, people felt I only have to do this for 6 more months and then I don't have to deal with, Afghanistan ever again. And for the military, military officers are able to say, it's above my pay grade. Yes. I'm not a policymaker. I execute policy. I don't make policy. They put on that type of this helmet somehow that allows them to dismiss any responsibility or accountability for their actions because they are not policymakers. And I've seen this over and over again. Right. Others would do rationalizations as well as that, well, I can, it's not about the big picture for me. It's about the men and women who are in my command. And I have an obligation to them. So they look downward, right? They don't look up, they look downward and say, I've got 150, 1,500, 15,000 men and women under my command. That's where my obligation lies. And I dealt with this. I went to the Iraq War in 2004, coming out of the Pentagon, with an understanding that this was a big mistake. And as we were understanding more and more, this is a war built on lies. And then getting there, but thinking when I went to the war that I would somehow be able to be moral in my own capacity. And I think that was one of the great lessons I have personally learned in my time at war, was that no matter who you are, whatever type of authority you think you have on your own moral actions is going to be subordinated and taken over by the immoral aspects of the greater war, that you don't have the agency that you think you do. The force of war is so great. It's a natural force. It's one of those things the Greeks and the Romans talked about, right? That you have no agency and you will be made an agent of the war. And then I did the same thing too. I went back, I continued with it, because I told myself, well, when I'm a senior person, then I'll do things differently, right? Which is what I heard from the Vietnam guys. Right? How, we had all these colonels and generals who had been in Vietnam, and they were telling us in the late 90s, we'll never be in another war like in Vietnam. And then within a few years, we were in 2 of them. Right? And then too, I would say things like when I went back to Iraq my second time, it was, well, I'm a pretty good officer. And I know other guys who, if they take this company of Marines and sailors over, they're going to get people killed. So then you start making, you rationalize, you lie to yourself, you give yourself excuses for continuing, to avoid being accountable for your own actions.
But Matthew, that's what makes you and every whistleblower just incredible human beings. Because it is so difficult to step outside that pre-made role, whether it be an officer or somebody in a bank or with the FBI, a government agency, and speak your truth to power and lose everything. A lot of whistleblowers have lost everything.
Oh, yeah.
But it's so important and so part of their identity. like yours, that you quit your job, you wrote this missive, and you stood up. And this was halfway through the war. You had the knowledge and you put it on paper and you sent it in, and it was their choice not to honor that or bring justice. So I think you are a warrior and a hero. Like all whistleblowers, you are unique. There's something special within you. And I don't know if it's part of your upbringing or whatever it is, there's something unique about whistleblowers, and you've shown that. And before we come to an end, is there something you'd like to say? I would like to incorporate you into our project. We are trying to bring about a National Whistleblower Day to bring justice to whistleblowers. I hope we can include you in that, because it is important whistleblowers get justice. But is there anything you'd like to say here at the end?
Well, I think there's a aspect, the psychological aspect of all this, the spiritual aspect of all this. And this is the crux of something I work on in veterans advocacy on moral injury, that, you've transgressed, whether by doing something or not doing something, you've transgressed your principles, your values. And more research is coming out on this, showing that this is a leading, if not the leading, factor in veteran suicides or combat veteran suicides, moral injury, right? This regret, this guilt, this shame. But it's very complex who we are because of moral reasons, ethical reasons, spiritual reasons, our upbringings, our psyche, our soul. And so I think when you start talking to whistleblowers, unpacking that and seeing how complex it actually is. And
yes.
I think you tell me, but probably better, than anyone else, but I don't think there's many whistleblowers out there who just see something and just act on it right away. This is a long process where you try and do things. You're trying because you believe in the institution, you believe in the work you're doing. Many of us who are part of the federal government or the military, we had a desire to serve.
Yes.
And so losing those institutions is terribly cataclysmic to our souls, to who we are as people. We lose our identity.
That's
and
right.
That has such an effect. And that's why I think you see so many whistleblowers who deal with PTSD, who are, to this day, this is something that I've talked to other folks about. I have never once had a former Marine of mine or sailor or really any military colleagues, subordinates, superiors, whoever, call me up and say, hey, you're a traitor. What you did was wrong. No, the opposite, right? I don't know how much contact I've had, people thanking me for doing this. Thank you for standing up for us. Thank you for, everything else. But to this day, right, 13 years later, Jane, if I was to look at my phone right now and see I've got a message from a Marine I haven't heard from in a long time, my thought right away is that he's going to be telling me off, right? Because I've still, all these years later, carry with me this notion that I've betrayed the institution.
Yes.
And I've betrayed the group. I let them down. I didn't do my part. And it's, this is, again, there's a lot of psychology involved. I think it's evolutionary, right? This goes back to, you don't want to be kicked out away from the campfire, right? Yeah. And have to go out in the woods with the wolves, right? So, and I just heard something the other day where they talked about this in the sense of the modern equivalent of that is being kicked out of the group chat, right? Kicked out of your group discussion or whatever on your phone, right? So you want to, so it is. I think there's an element here that is really, really complex, and that gets to, absolutely the core of who we are, as a species, basically, let alone individual.
Thank you, Matthew. You are just so inspiring, and I really appreciate it. We'll have a link to your article. You've appeared on lots of media. We'll make sure we link to a lot of things so people can learn more about you. And I really appreciate your time. You're just absolutely inspiring. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks, Jane. And thank you for what you do. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matthew.